The winter wind howled through the cracks in the weathered walls of the Broken Spur Saloon, a fitting backdrop to the melancholy that had settled over its patrons. Outside, snow blanketed the small town of Redemption Creek, Montana Territory, transforming the normally dusty Main Street into a pristine white canvas, disturbed only by the occasional set of footprints. Inside, warmth from the pot-bellied stove in the corner battled against the December chill, while the soft glow of oil lamps cast long shadows across the worn plank floor. In a far corner, Jack Calloway hunched over his whiskey, his weathered face a map of the 45 hard years he'd lived on this earth. The lines around his eyes had deepened in the past year, carved there by grief as much as by the relentless western sun. His calloused hands, built for roping cattle and breaking horses, now clutched his glass as if it were the only thing tethering him to this world. 300 miles of hard riding had brought him to this forgettable town, chasing rumors that grew more improbable with each retelling. Yet hope, that most stubborn of emotions, refused to die in his chest. "Another," he rasped to the barkeep, sliding his empty glass across the polished surface. The man nodded, reaching for a bottle of rye that had seen better days. Jack's gaze drifted to the entrance just as the door swung open, bringing with it a swirl of snowflakes and a woman unlike any he'd expected to find in a place like Redemption Creek. She stood for a moment in the doorway, snowflakes melting on her dark cloak, her eyes scanning the room with the wariness of someone accustomed to being watched. Her presence immediately silenced the usual saloon chatter, the piano player's fingers stalling mid-melody. Even in the dim light, Jack could see she was striking, not in the flashy way of saloon girls, but with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her surroundings. Her face bore the subtle lines of someone who'd seen enough of life to know its true value, yet retained a beauty that spoke of inner strength rather than fragility. As she moved toward the bar, Jack noticed she walked with a slight limp, her right hand instinctively resting on a worn leather satchel slung across her body. The saloon patron's eyes followed her progress, some with undisguised lust, others with suspicious curiosity. The barkeep raised an eyebrow as she approached, clearly as surprised by her presence as everyone else. "What can I get for you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone somewhere between respectful and uncertain. "Information," she replied, her voice low and melodious, with an accent Jack couldn't quite place. "And a room for the night, if one's available." The barkeep scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Information's free if I have it. Room will cost you $2, includes breakfast." She nodded, reaching into her satchel and producing the coins with practiced efficiency. "I'm looking for someone," she continued, seemingly oblivious to the attention she was drawing. "A man named James Blackwood. I have reason to believe he passed through here in the last month or so." The name hit Jack like a physical blow, causing him to set down his freshly poured whiskey with enough force to slosh some over the rim. It was a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in over a year, but one that had haunted his dreams and fueled his waking determination. James Blackwood, the man who had destroyed everything Jack had spent 20 years building. The barkeep's eyes narrowed slightly. "Can't say I recognize the name, ma'am. What business you got with this fella?" The woman's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Family business," she replied, in a tone that discouraged further questioning. Jack watched as she paid for her room and declined the offer of supper, requesting only that a bath be prepared. As she turned to follow the barkeep's directions to her quarters, her gaze briefly locked with Jack's across the room. Something passed between them in that moment, a flicker of recognition, not of each other's faces, but perhaps of something deeper, a shared purpose or pain that transcended their status as strangers. Then the connection broke as she disappeared up the narrow staircase, leaving Jack with his whiskey and his thoughts. He knew with absolute certainty that his solitary quest had just become considerably more complicated. Jack nursed his drink for another hour, listening to the desultory piano music that had resumed after the woman's departure, and the snippets of conversation that drifted his way. Occasional bursts of laughter from a poker game in the corner punctuated the general murmur. But his mind remained fixed on the woman and her inquiry about Blackwood. When the grandfather clock in the corner struck 9, Jack settled his tab and made his way to the boarding house across the street, where he'd taken a room upon arriving in Redemption Creek 3 days earlier. The snow had picked up, falling in thick, silent flakes that muffled his footsteps. The town was eerily quiet, most of its residents having retreated indoors to wait out the storm. In his sparsely furnished room, Jack removed his gun belt and hung it on the bedpost within easy reach, a habit formed over decades on the frontier. As he stretched out on the narrow bed, boots still on, he replayed the woman's words in his mind. Family business, she had said. What connection could she possibly have to James Blackwood? Was she a wife or lover, unaware of the man's true nature? Or perhaps she was hunting him for reasons of her own. Morning arrived with harsh clarity, the sun reflecting blindingly off the fresh snow. Jack rose before dawn, as was his custom, and stood at the window, watching as Redemption Creek slowly came to life. By 7, he was back at the Broken Spur, ostensibly for breakfast, though food was secondary to his need for information. The saloon was nearly empty at this hour, save for a pair of freight haulers drinking coffee at a corner table, discussing routes and weather in low voices. Jack took a seat that afforded a clear view of both the entrance and the staircase, ordered coffee and eggs, and settled in to wait. His patience was rewarded when half an hour later, the mysterious woman descended the stairs. In daylight, with her cloak removed, Jack could see her more clearly. She was tall for a woman, with honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical knot at the nape of her neck. Her dress was plain, but well made, the kind worn by a schoolteacher or a respectable widow. The satchel remained at her side. "Mind if I join you?" Jack asked, as she made her way toward an empty table. He'd risen to his feet, hat respectfully removed, employing the manners his mother had instilled in him long ago on their Tennessee farm. The woman hesitated, studying him with intelligent green eyes that missed nothing, not the gun on his hip, nor the strength in his stance, nor the intensity in his gaze. "Why would you want to do that, Mr. Calloway?" "Calloway," he supplied, "Jack Calloway, and I believe we might be looking for the same man." Her expression revealed nothing, but she pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, back straight, hands folded on the table. "I'm Sarah Blackwood," she said, watching carefully for his reaction. "James Blackwood is my brother. Now perhaps you'd care to tell me why you're looking for him." The revelation that she was Blackwood's sister rather than his wife momentarily threw Jack off balance. He hadn't considered this possibility. "I knew him," Jack replied carefully, "in Colorado. We had some business dealings that didn't end well." A vast understatement, but he wasn't ready to reveal everything to this woman, sister or not. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Calloway, I've traveled over 1,000 miles searching for my brother. I've been lied to, misdirected, propositioned, and nearly robbed along the way. I have neither the time nor the patience for half-truths. If you knew James, then you know he had a talent for leaving complications in his wake. I'm trying to find him before those complications catch up to him, or to me. Her directness was refreshing, if uncomfortable. Jack signaled the barkeep to bring coffee for Sarah before responding. Your brother stole from me, Mrs. Blackwood. Or is it Miss? Mrs., she confirmed, a shadow crossing her face. Though my husband has been dead these 3 years now. Jack nodded, filing away this information. My condolences. As I was saying, your brother took something that didn't belong to him, something valuable. I aim to get it back. Sarah accepted the coffee placed before her with a nod of thanks, then fixed Jack with a penetrating stare. Was it money? She asked bluntly. Jack's mouth tightened. In a manner of speaking, it was the deed to my ranch, the Flying J. Property I worked 20 years to build up from nothing. Your brother forged documents, bribed the right officials, and when I was away driving cattle to market, he had me declared dead. By the time I got back, he'd sold my land to the railroad for a small fortune and disappeared. Sarah's face had grown progressively paler as Jack spoke, her knuckles white around her coffee cup. When he finished, she set the cup down carefully, as if afraid it might shatter in her grip. I see, she said quietly. And I suppose you're planning to kill him when you find him? The question hung between them, stark and unavoidable. Jack had asked himself the same thing countless times during his months of searching. In his darkest moments, the answer had been an unequivocal yes. Now, faced with this woman's direct question, he found himself hesitating. I want justice, he finally said, and my property back, though I expect that's impossible now. The railroads already laid track across what used to be my grazing land. Sarah studied him for a long moment before responding. Justice and vengeance often look identical at first glance, Mr. Calloway. It's only in their aftermath that we see the difference. Before Jack could formulate a response, the saloon door banged open, admitting a blast of cold air and 3 men whose bearing instantly put him on alert. They were dressed like cowboys, but something in their eyes and the way they carried their weapons spoke of a different profession. Men who killed for money rather than defending themselves or their property. The leader, a tall man with a pockmarked face partially obscured by an unkempt beard, surveyed the room with cold eyes that lingered briefly on Sarah before moving on. Jack noticed how she seemed to shrink in her seat, turning her face away slightly, as if to avoid recognition. Friends of yours? He murmured, his hand instinctively moving closer to his sidearm. Not mine, she whispered, but possibly James's. He had a talent for attracting the wrong sort of attention. The men took a table on the opposite side of the room, ordering whiskey despite the early hour. They spoke in low voices, occasionally casting glances toward Jack and Sarah. We should leave, Sarah said quietly, separately. I don't like the way they're looking at us. Jack nodded almost imperceptibly, years of frontier living having taught him to recognize danger. You go first. Head to the general store across the street. I'll follow in a few minutes to make sure they don't trail you. Sarah gathered her satchel, her movements deliberately casual as she stood. Thank you, she said, just loudly enough for him to hear. For the coffee and the conversation. Then she was gone, moving across the room with dignity despite her limp, acknowledging the barkeep with a polite nod before stepping out into the snowy morning. Jack remained at the table, apparently absorbed in his coffee, while keeping the newcomers in his peripheral vision. Something about their presence bothered him beyond the obvious threat they represented. It was too coincidental. Their arrival so soon after he'd mentioned Blackwood to the barkeep. Either word traveled impossibly fast in Redemption Creek, or someone had been watching and waiting. He finished his coffee slowly, paid his bill, and exited the saloon, purposefully turning in the opposite direction from the general store. Once out of sight, he circled around, using the alleyways between buildings to approach the store from the rear. Sarah was inside, pretending to examine bolts of fabric while keeping an eye on the street through the front window. She showed no surprise when Jack appeared beside her, merely handing him a pair of gloves she'd apparently been holding. "I think we need to continue our conversation somewhere more private," she said, her voice steady, despite the tension evident in her posture. Jack nodded, understanding the need for pretense in case they were being observed. "I have a room at the boarding house," he offered, "or we could speak in yours at the saloon." Sarah shook her head slightly. "Neither. Both could be watched. Is there somewhere outside of town? Somewhere we could speak freely?" Jack considered this, weighing the risks of leaving town against the growing certainty that staying put was becoming increasingly dangerous. "There's an abandoned trapper's cabin about 3 miles north," he said finally. "I came across it while searching the area yesterday. It's not much, but it would give us privacy for a few hours." Sarah nodded. Decision made. "I'll need to collect my things from the saloon. Can you arrange for horses without attracting attention?" Within the hour, they were riding north, the town of Redemption Creek receding behind them. Jack had arranged for the horses through the livery stable's back entrance, telling the stable master they were going to check on a reportedly injured horse belonging to Sarah's absent brother. The explanation was plausible enough, and the stable master, eager for the business during the slow winter season, asked no further questions. The snow had stopped falling, but the temperature remained well below freezing, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. They rode in silence, both aware that conversation could carry across the open landscape. Sarah rode competently, despite her limp, which seemed to bother her less on horseback than on foot. Jack found himself revising his initial assessment of her. Whatever her background, she was clearly no stranger to frontier life. The cabin, when they reached it, was indeed humble, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and windows covered with oiled paper rather than glass. Jack quickly set about starting a fire, while Sarah unsaddled the horses and secured them in the crude lean-to attached to one side of the cabin. By the time she entered, stamping snow from her boots, a small fire was beginning to take the edge off the cabin's chill. "It's not much," Jack acknowledged, "but it'll do for a few hours." Sarah nodded, removing her cloak but keeping her satchel close as she took a seat on one of the crude benches near the fire. For a moment, they sat in silence, the gravity of their situation settling around them like the snow outside. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice low but clear. "I believe those men are bounty hunters, Mr. Calloway, and I believe they're looking for James, or for me, as a way to find him." Jack's suspicions were confirmed. "How long have they been following you?" "I'm not certain they were," she replied. "It's possible they were already in Redemption Creek, following the same rumors that led us both here." She paused, reaching into her satchel to withdraw a folded piece of paper, which she handed to Jack without comment. It was a wanted poster, the ink slightly faded but still legible. "Wanted, James Blackwood, for fraud, theft, and murder. $500 reward, dead or alive." The crude illustration bore a passable resemblance to the man Jack remembered, though it failed to capture the charisma that had made Blackwood so dangerous. "Murder?" Jack questioned, looking up from the poster. Who did he kill? Sarah's face was a mask of contained grief. My husband, she said simply. 3 years ago in St. Louis. That's why I'm looking for him, Mr. Calloway. Not to save him from men like you, to bring him to justice myself. The revelation hung in the air between them, altering the dynamics of their uneasy alliance. Jack studied her face, seeing now the buried pain beneath her composed exterior. I'm sorry, he said, meaning it. I had no idea. Sarah's laugh was brittle. How could you? James has always been skilled at compartmentalizing his life, keeping his various victims separate and unaware of each other. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. My husband, Thomas, was a bank manager. James needed money for some scheme or another. He was always chasing the next opportunity, the next fortune just beyond his grasp. When Thomas refused to give him access to funds that weren't his, James shot him in our home and fled. The authorities assumed it was a robbery gone wrong, but I knew better. I've been tracking him ever since, following rumors and sightings across half the country. Jack handed the poster back to her, his mind racing to incorporate this new information. And now we're both in Redemption Creek, following the same cold trail. Sarah nodded, returning the poster to her satchel. The last confirmed sighting I have is from Cheyenne, 2 months ago. He was gambling heavily, losing more than winning according to my source. He mentioned heading to Montana Territory for business opportunities related to the railroad expansion. Jack's jaw tightened at the mention of railroads. That fits with what I know. After he sold my ranch to the Denver and Rio Grande, he seemed to develop a pattern of targeting properties in the path of planned rail lines. He paused, a new thought occurring to him. These bounty hunters, they're not working for the law, are they? Sarah shook her head. I doubt it. The official reward is only $500, not enough to motivate men like that to track someone across multiple territories in winter. She hesitated before continuing. I believe they're working for Ethan Holloway. He was James's partner in several schemes before they had a falling out. According to what I've gathered, James left Holloway to take the blame for a land swindle in Wyoming last year. Holloway spent 6 months in prison and reportedly swore to kill James when he got out. Jack absorbed this information, mentally cataloging it alongside what he already knew. So we have competition in our search, he mused, and dangerous competition at that. Sarah's green eyes met his, unflinching. It would seem so. Which raises the question, Mr. Calloway, what do we do now? The question hung between them, laden with implications. Jack rose and moved to the window, carefully peering out at the snow-covered landscape. No sign of pursuit yet, but that didn't mean they weren't being followed. We have 3 options as I see it, he said finally, turning back to face her. We can go our separate ways, each continuing to search independently. We can work together, pooling our information and resources. Or we can leave Redemption Creek entirely, abandoning the search in this area. He didn't mention the 4th option, giving up the search altogether, knowing instinctively that neither of them would consider it. Sarah considered his words, her face thoughtful. Working together would seem the most practical solution, at least temporarily. We both want to find James, albeit for different reasons, and there's safety in numbers given our new friends in town. Jack nodded slowly, weighing the proposal. There was logic in her suggestion, but trusting her meant trusting the sister of the man who had ruined him. Yet something in her direct gaze, in the shared loss they had both suffered at James Blackwood's hands, compelled him toward agreement. All right, Mrs. Blackwood, a temporary alliance until we find your brother. He extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, she took it. Her grip was firm, her hands surprisingly calloused for a woman who presented herself so properly. "Sarah," she said, "if we're to be allies, you might as well use my given name." Jack inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Sarah, then, and I'm Jack." Their hands separated, but something had shifted between them. A tentative trust, born of necessity and common purpose. "We should head back to town before dark," Jack said, glancing at the lowering sun, visible through the paper-covered window. "We'll need supplies if we're going to pick up your brother's trail." Sarah nodded in agreement, already reaching for her cloak. "We should return separately," she suggested. "If those men are watching, we don't want to confirm any suspicions they might have about our cooperation." Jack considered this, then shook his head. "If they're any good at their job, and they looked it, they already know we left town together. Better to face them directly than play cat and mouse." He checked his revolver, a well-maintained Colt .45 that had seen him through countless tight situations. "Besides, I don't much like the idea of you riding back alone with those men possibly watching the trails." A flash of something, annoyance, perhaps, or surprised appreciation, crossed Sarah's face. "I've been taking care of myself for 3 years on this hunt, Mr. Calloway." "Jack," she corrected herself, "I'm not without resources." As if to emphasize her point, she reached into her satchel and withdrew a small derringer, checking its load before returning it to its hiding place. Jack raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The small gun was better than nothing, but would do little against determined men with rifles and six-shooters. "Nevertheless," he said, "we've agreed to work together. That means watching each other's backs." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded briskly. "Very well, together then. But we should have a plan for when we reach town. Those men will be watching and possibly waiting." They spent the next half hour formulating a strategy, agreeing that the most prudent course was to collect their belongings from their respective lodgings and depart Redemption Creek as soon as possible. "The stage to Helena leaves tomorrow morning," Sarah informed him. "From there, we can take the train east to Billings. I have a contact there who might have more recent information on James." Jack frowned slightly. "The stage is predictable. If these bounty hunters are determined, they'll either try to stop us before we board or follow the stage themselves." He considered their options. "There's another way. I know a man in town who runs private freight to Helena twice a week. For the right price, he might be persuaded to leave tonight and take passengers." Sarah nodded, approval evident in her expression. "That would be preferable. Can you arrange it without raising suspicion?" "I believe so," Jack replied. "The freight haulers I saw at breakfast, one of them is Bill Turner. We've crossed paths before in Wyoming. He owes me a favor." He began kicking snow over the fire, extinguishing it carefully. "We should move quickly. Daylight's burning, and I'd rather not be on the trails after dark if we can help it." As they prepared to leave, saddling the horses and securing their minimal belongings, Jack found himself studying Sarah surreptitiously. There was a competence to her movements, a quiet efficiency that spoke of a woman accustomed to handling difficult situations. Yet there was vulnerability too, evident in the way she occasionally glanced over her shoulder, or the tight set of her jaw when James' name was mentioned. She was, Jack realized, a complex woman shaped by tragedy and determination, not unlike himself. The ride back to Redemption Creek was tense but uneventful, both of them scanning the surrounding countryside for signs of pursuit or ambush. They approached town from the east, using the cover of a stand of pine trees to observe the main street before committing to enter. The town appeared normal, a few people moving between buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, the blacksmith's hammer ringing out from his shop. "I don't see our friends from this morning," Jack murmured, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. That doesn't mean they're not there, Sarah responded, her voice equally low. What's our play? Jack considered for a moment, then made his decision. We'll go in together, straight to the livery. I'll find Turner while you wait with the horses. Once I've made arrangements, we'll collect our things and meet back there, quick and clean. Their entrance into town went smoothly, the few people on the streets paying them little mind as they made their way to the livery stable. The stable master greeted them with a nod, commenting only that the horses seemed to have held up well despite the cold. Jack explained that they'd found the injured horse and determined it belonged to a different outfit, not Sarah's brother as they'd thought. The stable master accepted this with the easy credulity of a man whose business relied on discretion. Turner around? Jack asked casually as he unsaddled his horse. Saw him at breakfast. Thought I might catch up before he heads out again. The stable master jerked his thumb toward the back of the building. In the office, doing his accounts. You know how Bill is. Always counting pennies, even when there's dollars to be made. Sarah remained with the horses as agreed, while Jack made his way to the cramped space that served as the freight company's office. Bill Turner was indeed there, hunched over a ledger, his reading spectacles perched precariously on his bulbous nose. He looked up as Jack entered, recognition dawning slowly on his weathered face. Calloway? Jack Calloway? Well, I'll be damned. Last I heard, you were dead. Killed by Comanche down Colorado way. Jack's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. News of my death was greatly exaggerated and deliberately spread. Good to see you, Bill. The two men shook hands, Turner's beefy paw engulfing Jack's leaner one. What brings you to this godforsaken corner of the territory? Not much here, except snow and boredom. Jack glanced over his shoulder, ensuring they were alone before responding. I need a favor, Bill. One that pays well, but requires discretion. 20 minutes later, Jack emerged from the office with arrangements made. Turner would depart for Helena that evening at 8, ostensibly to deliver urgent freight that couldn't wait for his regular run. Jack and Sarah would ride with him, concealed among the cargo, until they were well clear of Redemption Creek. The price was steep but fair, given the risk and the short notice. Jack found Sarah where he'd left her, outwardly calm, but with tension evident in the set of her shoulders. It's arranged, he informed her quietly. 8 o'clock. We need to collect our things and be back here by 7:30. Sarah nodded, relief briefly softening her features. Did you see any sign of our friends while you were talking to Turner? Jack shook his head. No, but that doesn't mean they're not watching. Best to move quickly and stay alert. They agreed to meet back at the livery at the appointed time, then separated. Jack to the boarding house, Sarah to the Broken Spur. Jack retrieved his few possessions from his room at the boarding house without incident, settling his bill with the proprietor with a brief explanation about unexpected business requiring his immediate departure. The woman who ran the establishment seemed unconcerned, merely nodding and wishing him safe travels. As he stepped back onto the street, the winter sun was already beginning its early descent, casting long shadows between the buildings. Jack kept to these shadows as much as possible as he made his way toward the livery, his saddlebags slung over one shoulder, his rifle case under his arm. He was halfway to his destination when instinct, more than sound or sight, made him duck into a narrow alley between the hardware store and the barber shop. A moment later, 2 of the men from the saloon passed by, walking with the deceptively casual air of predators, trying not to alert their prey. Jack pressed himself against the wall of the hardware store, barely breathing as the men paused at the intersection, clearly debating which way to proceed. She ain't at the saloon no more, one of them said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Paid her bill and collected her things about an hour ago. The other man spat tobacco juice into the snow. Boggs is checking the stage office. Maybe she bought a ticket out. And the cowboy? The first man asked. Stildy defined him too. Boss was clear. Anyone helping her is to be considered same as the brother. Jack's hand moved imperceptibly toward his revolver, ready if the men should turn down the alley. But after another moment of discussion, they moved on, heading toward the general store. Jack waited until they were out of sight before continuing on his way, now even more certain that their departure from Redemption Creek couldn't come soon enough. He reached the livery without further incident, finding Bill Turner already preparing the wagon for departure. Your lady friend's inside, Turner informed him, nodding toward the stable proper. Arrived about 10 minutes ago, looking like she had the devil himself on her heels. Jack thanked him and entered the stable, finding Sarah seated on a hay bale, her satchel and a small carpet bag beside her. She looked up sharply at his approach, her hand moving toward her satchel before she recognized him. You made it, she said, relief evident in her voice. I was beginning to worry. Had a close call, Jack admitted, setting down his belongings. 2 of our friends from this morning are searching the town. Seems they're not just after your brother anymore. They're after you and anyone helping you. Sarah's expression tightened. Holloway must be offering a substantial reward. Those men aren't the type to pursue a personal vendetta across multiple territories in winter. Jack nodded in agreement, keeping his voice low despite the empty stable. They mentioned a boss. Must be Holloway. They know you've left the saloon, and they're checking the stage office. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her satchel, a gesture Jack had noticed before. All the more reason to leave tonight, she said. Mr. Turner is preparing the wagon? He is. We'll be hidden among crates of mining supplies and dry goods. Not comfortable, but it'll get us to Helena without attracting attention. He paused, studying her face in the dim light of the stable. Are you certain your contact in Billings will have useful information? We're taking considerable risks based on that assumption. Sarah met his gaze steadily. As certain as one can be in these circumstances, the man was James's banker before everything happened. He's been keeping an eye out for any transactions or appearances James might make. Jack accepted this with a nod, then moved to help Turner with the final preparations. The next hour passed in tense waiting, both of them staying out of sight as the stable master closed up for the evening and Turner made his final arrangements. At precisely 8 o'clock, they climbed into the wagon, concealing themselves among the cargo as planned. Turner had created a space just large enough for 2 people, shielded from view by stacked crates and covered with canvas to protect against the bitter cold. As the wagon lurched into motion, Jack and Sarah found themselves pressed together in the confined space, their breath mingling in the frigid air. It's about a 6-hour journey to Helena in these conditions, Jack whispered. Try to get some rest if you can. I'll keep watch for the first few hours. Sarah nodded, adjusting her position slightly to find what comfort was possible among the hard edges of crates and the constant swaying of the wagon. Despite Jack's suggestion, he doubted either of them would sleep much. The threat of pursuit, combined with the bone-chilling cold that seeped through their layers of clothing, made rest an unlikely prospect. As the wagon cleared the town limits and picked up speed on the open road, Jack found himself acutely aware of Sarah's proximity. Her shoulder pressed against his, her warmth a stark contrast to the winter night surrounding them. Jack, she said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the creaking of the wagon and the horses' steady hoofbeats. "Thank you for helping me. You didn't have to." The simple sincerity in her voice caught him off guard, reminding him that beneath her composed exterior was a woman who had been alone in her quest for justice far longer than anyone should have to be. "We both want the same thing," he replied after a moment. "Finding your brother." But even as he said it, Jack recognized that his motivations had begun to shift subtly since meeting Sarah. His desire for retribution against James Blackwood remained, but it had been joined by something else, a growing determination to help this woman find her own justice, her own peace. As the wagon continued its journey through the Montana night, the stars cold and distant overhead, Jack Calloway found himself wondering if, perhaps, his long pursuit had led him not just to his enemy, but to something, someone he hadn't known he was seeking. The road to Helena stretched before them, fraught with danger, but also possibility. Whatever awaited them there, and beyond in Billings, Jack knew with certainty that his path and Sarah's were now inextricably linked, at least until they found the man who had changed both their lives forever. The hours passed slowly, the monotonous rhythm of the wagon wheels against the packed snow, broken only by occasional murmured conversation between Jack and Sarah. They shared information about James Blackwood, Jack describing the charismatic but ruthless businessman he'd encountered in Colorado, Sarah filling in details of her brother's earlier years. "He wasn't always this way," she said softly, her voice tinged with the particular sorrow that comes from watching someone you love become unrecognizable. "As a boy, he was brilliant and kind. Our father was hard on him, expected perfection, and showed little affection. After father died, something in James just broke, like he'd been keeping himself in check all those years, and suddenly the restraints were gone." Jack listened silently, recognizing the familiar story of how childhood wounds could shape a man's character, for better or worse. His own father had been different, demanding but fair, teaching Jack the value of honest work and straight dealing. "What will you do if we find him?" Sarah asked after a long silence, her question floating between them in the darkness. Jack had asked himself the same thing countless times during his months of searching. The answer had evolved from hot-blooded vengeance to something more complex. "I want him to face consequences," he finally said. "Real consequences, not just disappearing with my property and starting fresh somewhere else. Whether that's a jail cell or..." He left the alternative unspoken. Sarah's voice was steady when she responded. "I used to lie awake at night imagining putting a bullet in him myself, for what he did to Thomas, for destroying the only happiness I'd ever known." She paused, and Jack felt, rather than saw her shake her head. "But I've come to realize that killing him wouldn't bring Thomas back. It wouldn't even bring me peace. Justice might." Dawn was breaking as they approached Helena, the eastern sky lightening from black to deep blue to the pale rose of winter sunrise. Turner had maintained a steady pace through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. As they reached the outskirts of the territorial capital, he rapped on the side of the wagon, their signal to prepare for arrival. Jack and Sarah emerged stiffly from their hiding place, stretching cramped limbs and blinking in the pale morning light. Helena was considerably larger than Redemption Creek, a proper city with multiple hotels, businesses, and the impressive stone edifice of the Territorial Capitol building visible on a hill overlooking the main thoroughfare. Turner dropped them near the train station as agreed, accepting Jack's payment with a firm handshake and a promise of discretion. Far as anyone from Redemption Creek is concerned, I traveled alone last night, he assured them. The eastbound train to Billings doesn't leave until tomorrow morning, Sarah informed Jack, as they stood on the platform, their meager belongings at their feet. We'll need lodging for the night. Jack nodded, scanning their surroundings with habitual wariness. Helena was busy even at this early hour, miners and businessmen and ordinary citizens going about their morning routines. We should split up, he suggested. Take rooms at different hotels. If Holloway's men manage to follow us or telegraph ahead, they'll be looking for a man and woman traveling together. Sarah considered this, then shook her head. I think we're safer together at this point. They know what both of us look like now, and 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. There was logic in her argument, but Jack suspected there was more to it. The same reluctance to be alone that he himself felt after their shared ordeal. They settled on a modest hotel 2 blocks from the station, taking rooms adjacent to each other for security. The desk clerk barely glanced at them as they registered. Jack as himself, and Sarah as Mrs. Turner, a small deception that might buy them time if anyone came looking. Their rooms were small but clean, each with a narrow bed, washstand, and window overlooking the busy street below. I suggest we rest for a few hours, then explore the city, Jack said as they stood in the hallway between their rooms. There's a telegraph office here. We might be able to send a message to your contact in Billings. Let him know we're coming. Sarah nodded, fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. A good plan. I'm afraid I wouldn't be much use without some sleep. They parted ways, each entering their respective rooms. But Jack found himself pausing with his hand on the doorknob, oddly reluctant to let Sarah out of his sight. Sleep came in fitful bursts, Jack's body demanding rest while his mind remained vigilant. By mid-afternoon, he had given up the attempt, dressing and making his way downstairs to the hotel's small dining room. He was halfway through a plate of beef stew when Sarah appeared, looking refreshed despite the still evident weariness around her eyes. She had changed into a clean, high-collared blouse and dark skirt, her honey-brown hair freshly arranged in its practical knot. She slid into the chair across from him, ordering coffee from the passing waiter. I've been thinking, she said without preamble, once the waiter had moved out of earshot, about our next steps after Billings. Assuming my contact has information about James's whereabouts, we'll need to decide how to proceed. Jack set down his fork, giving her his full attention. You're concerned about what happens when we find him. It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway, her green eyes serious. We both want justice, Jack, but what that looks like to each of us might be very different. I need to know that when the moment comes, we'll be in agreement about how to handle James. It was a fair concern, and one that Jack had considered himself during his restless attempts at sleep. What do you propose? He asked, genuinely curious about her solution to this potential conflict. Sarah took a sip of the coffee that had arrived, gathering her thoughts. If James is alive, we turn him over to the proper authorities. We both have legitimate legal claims against him. You for fraud and theft. Me for... She paused, her voice catching slightly. For Tonnis's murder. No vigilante justice, no matter how tempting or deserved it might seem in the moment. Jack considered her words carefully, aware that his answer would define the parameters of their partnership going forward. In his darkest moments during the past year, he had imagined confronting Blackwood with gun in hand, forcing the man to acknowledge what he had stolen, before exacting a final retribution. But those fantasies had never brought him peace, only a hollow sense of anticipated satisfaction that he suspected would prove empty in reality. "Agreed," he said finally. "We find him, we secure him, we deliver him to a federal marshal or territorial judge. Let the law decide his punishment." Relief washed over Sarah's face, and Jack realized how much this question had been weighing on her. "Thank you," she said simply. "I needed to hear that." After finishing their meal, they ventured into the city, making their way first to the telegraph office. Sarah composed a brief message to her contact in Billings, informing him of their expected arrival the following evening and requesting a meeting. The telegraph operator assured them the message would be sent immediately, though delivery would depend on conditions along the line. Their next stop was a general store, where they replenished their supplies: ammunition for Jack's revolver and rifle, basic foodstuffs in case of delays in their journey, and for Sarah, a few personal necessities. As they moved through the crowded streets, Jack maintained a watchful eye on their surroundings, alert for any sign of pursuit. Helena was large enough that two more strangers hardly warranted notice, but caution had become second nature after the events in Redemption Creek. They returned to the hotel as evening fell, the streets now illuminated by gas lamps that cast pools of yellow light on the snow-covered boardwalks. After a simple supper in the hotel dining room, they retired to the small sitting area near the lobby, where a cheerful fire provided warmth and a measure of privacy for conversation. "Tell me about your ranch," Sarah said, as they sat side by side on a worn settee, their voices low to avoid being overheard by the few other hotel guests scattered around the room. The request caught Jack off guard. It had been months since anyone had asked him about the Flying J, and longer still since he had allowed himself to dwell on memories of the home and life he had lost. "It wasn't much compared to some spreads," he began hesitantly. "But it was mine. 20 years of work, starting with just 50 acres and a broken-down cabin." As he spoke, the details came flooding back: the view of the mountains from this front porch, the particular scent of sage after rain, the satisfaction of watching his herd grow from a dozen scraggly cattle to over 500 prime beef. "I had 6 men working for me at the end," he continued, warming to the subject despite the ache of loss it evoked. "Good men, loyal, don't know what happened to them after." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Sarah's hand moved to cover his briefly, the gesture so unexpected that Jack nearly pulled away in surprise. "I'm sorry," she said, genuine empathy in her voice. "To build something like that from nothing, only to have it taken away. I understand that kind of loss." And Jack realized that she did understand, perhaps better than anyone else could. The conversation shifted to safer topics: books they had read, places they had seen in their travels, observations about the territorial capital surrounding them. As they talked, Jack found himself noticing details about Sarah he had missed in the urgency of their flight from Redemption Creek. The way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled, the graceful movement of her hands as she emphasized a point, the quiet intelligence evident in her every word. She was, he realized, a remarkable woman, one who had faced tragedy and hardship without surrendering to bitterness or despair. By the time they agreed to retire for the night, Jack was conscious of a shift in his perception of their partnership. What had begun as an alliance of convenience, born of shared purpose, had evolved into something more complex, a genuine connection he had not anticipated or sought. Standing in the hallway between their rooms, An awkward moment stretched between them, neither quite ready to part ways. "We should try to get some real rest tonight," Sarah said finally, breaking the silence. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Jack nodded in agreement, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, the narrow hallway bringing them into proximity that felt both accidental and inevitable. "Good night then, Sarah," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I'll knock on your door at 6. Train leaves at 7. She smiled, a small, private expression that reached her eyes. "Good night, Jack," she replied, then hesitated before adding, "I'm glad we found each other in Redemption Creek, despite the circumstances." Before he could respond, she had slipped into her room, the door closing softly behind her. Jack entered his own room, removing his gun belt and boots, but keeping his clothes on. Another habit formed over years on the frontier. As he stretched out on the narrow bed, his mind returned to their conversation by the fire, to Sarah's hand briefly covering his, to the moment just passed in the hallway. He had not expected, when he rode into Redemption Creek days earlier, to find anything but another cold trail in his pursuit of James Blackwood. Instead, he had found a partner in that pursuit, and perhaps something more, something he had believed lost to him along with his ranch and his former life. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. After Catherine's death from fever 7 years earlier, Jack had resigned himself to solitude, finding purpose in his work and later in his quest for justice. The possibility of another kind of purpose, another kind of connection, was a complication he hadn't prepared for. Morning arrived with a light snowfall, large flakes drifting past the window as Jack prepared for the day ahead. He was just buckling his gun belt when a soft knock sounded at his door. Sarah stood in the hallway, already dressed for travel in a practical wool dress and heavy cloak, her satchel and carpet bag beside her. "There's a problem," she said without preamble. "I've just come from the station. The train to Billings has been delayed due to snow on the tracks further east. They're saying it might not depart until tomorrow." Jack absorbed this news with a frown, immediately considering the implications. A delay meant another day in Helena, another opportunity for Holloway's men to catch up to them if they had indeed followed or received word of their whereabouts. "Did you check if there are alternative routes? A stagecoach, perhaps?" Sarah shook her head. "The stagecoach line doesn't run to Billings in winter. It's the train or nothing." They decided over a hasty breakfast to maintain their hotel rooms for another night and to use the unexpected delay to their advantage. "We need more information," Jack reasoned. "About Holloway, about those bounty hunters, and about your brother's recent movements. Helena's the territorial capital. There must be law offices, newspaper archives, places we can learn more about what we're facing." Sarah agreed, her practical nature asserting itself despite the setback. They spent the morning at the territorial courthouse, where Sarah's quiet charm and invented story about researching her family history gained them access to records of recent criminal cases. There, they found confirmation of what Sarah had told Jack. Ethan Holloway had indeed been convicted of fraud in Wyoming territory and served 6 months in prison. His release date was 3 months earlier, plenty of time for him to organize a pursuit of the man he believed had betrayed him. In the afternoon, they visited the offices of the Helena Daily Herald, where again Sarah took the lead, presenting herself as a writer researching frontier development for an Eastern publication. The editor, flattered by the attention and impressed by Sarah's articulate queries, allowed them to browse recent editions of the paper. Among the various reports of railroad expansion, mining developments, and territorial politics, they found a small item dated just 2 weeks earlier. James Blackwood, representing Eastern investors, has purchased significant land holdings near the town of Fort Benton, reportedly for agricultural development. Mr. Blackwood declined to name his backers, but expressed confidence that the venture would bring prosperity to the region. Jack and Sarah exchanged glances of mingled surprise and vindication. If the report was accurate, James Blackwood was less than 100 miles away at the head of steamboat navigation on the Missouri River. Fort Benton, Jack mused as they left the newspaper office, their steps quickening with renewed purpose. It makes sense. It's a transportation hub, perfect for moving goods in and out of the territory. Sarah nodded, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at having found a fresher trail, apprehension at the prospect of finally confronting her brother. The railroad runs there as well, she noted. We could change our tickets, be there by tomorrow evening instead of Billings. The decision was quickly made, and they returned to the station to arrange the change in their travel plans. The ticket agent informed them that the Fort Benton train was scheduled to depart on time the following morning, weather permitting. As they walked back to their hotel, the snow falling more heavily now, Jack was conscious of a growing tension, the sense of a hunt nearing its conclusion after months of frustrating dead ends. They dined in the hotel restaurant that evening, both preoccupied with thoughts of what awaited them in Fort Benton. If it really is him, Sarah said, breaking a long silence, we need to be prepared. James won't come quietly, not with the charges against him. Jack nodded in agreement, his mind already working through various scenarios. We'll need help from local law enforcement. I'm not naive enough to think the two of us can apprehend him alone, especially if he has men working for him. Sarah's expression clouded slightly. That assumes the local law isn't already in his pocket. You know how James operates. Bribes, favors, creating a network of protection wherever he goes. It was a valid concern, one that Jack had considered himself. Then we gather evidence first, confirm it's him, learn his routine, his vulnerabilities. We don't make a move until we're certain we can succeed. As they continued discussing their approach, Jack noticed Sarah's increasing agitation, visible in the way she twisted her napkin, in the tension around her eyes, despite her outwardly calm demeanor. Finally, he reached across the table, gently stilling her restless hands with one of his own. Sarah, he said quietly, it's all right to be afraid, not just of the danger, but of facing him again after all this time. Her eyes met his, surprise giving way to grudging acknowledgement. Is it that obvious? She asked, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Only to someone who's been watching you closely, Jack replied, then added with unexpected honesty, someone who cares about what happens to you. The admission hung between them, neither quite ready to address its implications. They lingered at the table long after their meal was finished, reluctant to part ways despite the early departure awaiting them the next day. When they finally rose to retire to their rooms, the hotel had grown quiet, most guests already seeking their beds against the cold winter night. In the hallway outside their rooms, that same awkward moment from the previous evening repeated itself, a hesitation, a reluctance to part, words that remained unspoken. Jack, Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, Would you mind sitting with me for a while? I find I'm not ready for solitude just yet. The request, so simply stated, yet laden with potential meanings, caught Jack off guard. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. Of course. Sarah's room was identical to his own, small, functional, warmed by a modest fire in the small grate. She gestured for him to take the room's only chair while she perched on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. For a time, neither spoke, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. "I'm afraid," Sarah finally admitted, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Not of James, exactly, but of what seeing him again will do to me. Of whether I'll be able to hold to our agreement when I'm standing before the man who murdered my husband." Jack watched her face, understanding the courage it took to voice such a fear. "You'll hold to it," he said with quiet certainty, "because you're stronger than your desire for revenge. I've seen that strength in you from the moment we met." Sarah looked up at him then, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "And you?" she asked. "Are you stronger than your desire for revenge, Jack Calloway?" It was a fair question, one that probed at the very core of the man he had become during his months of pursuit. "I believe I am now," he answered honestly, "though I might not have been when I first set out to find Blackwood. Things have changed since then." "What things?" Sarah pressed, her gaze holding his. Jack considered his words carefully, knowing that his answer would irrevocably alter the nature of their partnership. "My perspective, my priorities. Meeting you has—" He paused, searching for the right words. "It's reminded me that there's more to life than settling old scores, that even after everything that's been taken, there might still be something worth finding." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions, with possibilities neither had allowed themselves to consider in the wake of their respective losses. Finally, Sarah rose from the bed and moved to stand before him, her expression resolute. "Share my bed tonight," she said softly, the words both request and warning. "And I'll leave tomorrow. After Fort Benton, after James. Whatever happens, we go our separate ways." "I can't," she faltered, then continued with renewed determination. "I can't risk losing someone else I care for. Not again." Jack stood slowly, closing the small distance between them until they were standing toe-to-toe, her upturned face inches from his. "What if I'm not willing to let you go so easily?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "What if, after all this is over, I want to see where this road leads us?" Sarah's eyes searched his, looking for reassurance or perhaps resolution. "Jack," she whispered, "I've spent 3 years pursuing justice for a ghost. I don't know who I am beyond that pursuit anymore. I don't know if I can be what you need." Jack shook his head slightly, a small smile softening his weathered features. "I'm not asking for promises, Sarah. Just possibility. The chance to find out who we both are after justice has been served." He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and tucked a stray strand of honey-brown hair behind her ear. "Tomorrow will come regardless. Tonight is ours if we want it." For a long moment, Sarah remained still, balanced on the precipice of decision. Then, with a small sound that might have been resignation or release, she leaned forward, closing the final distance between them. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative, the kiss of two people who had forgotten the taste of tenderness in the wake of prolonged sorrow. Then, as if a dam had broken, it deepened into something more urgent, more honest. Jack's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as her hands moved to frame his face, her touch both questioning and certain. When they finally parted, breathless, Sarah's eyes held a vulnerability Jack hadn't seen before. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Not of this, of after, of hoping for something beyond vengeance." Jack understood her fear all too well, the terrifying prospect of opening oneself to possibility after shutting down every emotion except determination and anger. "We face that fear together," he promised, "one day at a time." What followed was a night of gentle discovery, of comfort found in shared warmth, of two bodies learning each other's rhythms and responses. In the firelight, Jack traced the map of Sarah's life on her skin, the small scar at her collarbone from a childhood fall, the slight calluses on her hands that spoke of a woman unafraid of work, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes that crinkled when she smiled. For her part, Sarah explored the geography of Jack's weathered body with wonder. The broad shoulders, shaped by years of ranch work, the healed bullet wound on his left side from a cattle rustler's ambush, the strength in his hands that could be so surprisingly gentle. They spoke little, words seeming inadequate for the solace they found in each other's embrace, the temporary shelter from the storm of pursuit and vengeance that had driven them both for so long. Dawn arrived all too soon, pale light filtering through the curtains as Jack and Sarah prepared for the journey ahead. There was a new ease between them, a quiet understanding that required no discussion. As they gathered their belongings and made their way to the station, Jack found himself studying Sarah's profile in the early morning light. The determined set of her jaw, the grace with which she carried herself, despite the weight of her mission. Whatever happened in Fort Benton, he knew with absolute certainty that their lives had been irrevocably altered by their meeting in that snowbound saloon in Redemption Creek. The train awaited them, belching steam into the cold Montana morning, ready to carry them the final miles of their long pursuit. As they boarded, Jack's hand found Sarah's, their fingers intertwining briefly before separating. A promise without words, a possibility beyond vengeance. The steel rails stretched before them toward Fort Benton, toward James Blackwood, toward justice long denied. But for Jack Calloway, the horizon now held something else as well, the chance for a new beginning, a life reclaimed not through retribution, but through connection. As the train pulled away from Helena, gathering speed toward their destination, he glanced at Sarah seated beside him, her gaze fixed on the snowy landscape beyond the window. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, bound not just by common purpose, but by something far more powerful. The discovery that even in the harshest winter, spring's promise could be found. Their story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.